purchase contracts in Tibet and Hong Kong. In 2 days, it will be exactly 70 years since Tibet has lost its independence. On 23rd of May, 1951, the Chinese government forced Tibetan delegates in Beijing to sign the so-called 17-point agreement, which aimed at incorporating Tibet formally into the People's Republic of China. Shortly after the communists had come to power in China, the People's Liberation Army invaded Western Tibet and continued to put pressure on the Tibetan government. Tonight, we want to talk about the significance of the 17-point agreement. What is it? Why is it problematic? We will also talk about how the Chinese government has failed to fulfill its obligations since the treaty itself actually grants Tibetans significant political and cultural rights. When we look at the situation in Hong Kong today, we can see certain parallels of how the Chinese government is breaching contracts once again, especially by implementing the national security law in Hong Kong last year. The government in mainland China has interfered into Hong Kong's democratic freedom like never before, and it has ignored its obligations under the Sino-British Joint Declaration from 1984. How much of Tibet's experience can we find in the example of Hong Kong, and what can be done so both Tibet and Hong Kong can overcome the Communist Party's tight grip and restore political self-determination? For this discussion, I'm very happy to introduce 3 experts from Tibet and Hong Kong. Khetan Gyaltsen is the former special representative to His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Europe. In the past, he worked as a representative of His Holiness in Switzerland, his Secretary of International Relations in Dharamsala, as well as head of Tibet offices in Brussels and Geneva. Between 2002 and 2010, he was one of the 2 envoys of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, conducting the dialogue with the Chinese leadership, where he engaged in 9 rounds of formal discussions and 1 informal meeting with representatives of the Chinese government. He's also on the advisory board of Tibet Initiative. Tinlai Chukyi is the special appointee for human rights at the Tibet Bureau, Geneva. Previously, she worked as a researcher at the UN EU and Human Rights Desk at the Central Tibetan Administration in Dharamsala. She spoke at several conferences, including at UN side events, and has also organized talks on Tibet, including at Harvard Law School, where she pursued a master's degree in law in 2018. Ray Wong is a Hong Kong activist. He founded the political party Hong Kong Indigenous, whose slogan, "Liberate Hong Kong, the revolution of our time," has become one of the main slogans in the anti-extradition law movement. He was charged with inciting a riot in the Mongkok civil unrest called the Fishbowl Revolution in 2016. In May 2018, he has become the first refugee from Hong Kong recognized by the German federal government. So we'd now like to start with the opening statements of each of the 3 experts. We asked Khetan and Tinlai to talk about what the 17-point agreement is and why is it problematic, and also kind of to explain a little bit what the human rights situation has been over the past 70 years in Tibet. And then Ray will go on to explain what the Sino-British Joint Declaration is. So we'll start off with Khetan, please.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion. And I'm very, very grateful to the Tibet Initiative in Deutschland for holding this talk. As you already mentioned, it's 2 days, the 70th anniversary of signing of this agreement will take place. So I think, what is important with regard to the 17-point agreement, it highlights 3 fundamental points. One point is the military aggression preceding the signing of the 17-point agreement. The second point is the rule of international law and the validity of this agreement. And the third point is the legitimacy of the Chinese rule in Tibet and the present status of Tibet. So preceding the signing of the 17-point agreement, there was the military invasion of Tibet by the People's Liberation Army of the PRC. In October 1950, a 4,000 strong troop of People's Liberation Army attacked Chamdo, the capital of Eastern Tibet and other areas. And the Tibetan government had stationed there a small army of around 8,000 troops to guard the area. The Tibetan troops were ill-equipped, badly trained, and inexperienced in warfare. So within 2 weeks, the People's Liberation Army defeated the Tibetan army and captured the Tibetan Governor General of Kham, Eastern Tibet. After defeating the Tibetan army, Beijing called on Lhasa to send officials for negotiations. When the People's Liberation Army marched into Tibet, the Tibetan government appealed to the United Nations, to the governments of USA, Britain, India, and Canada for help and intervention. But unfortunately, no help was forthcoming. So Tibet was left with no viable alternative but to negotiate. The 17-point agreement that was drafted by the Chinese side and presented to the Tibetan delegation contains the following main points. Tibet shall return to the big family of the motherland, the People's Republic of China. The Tibetan people shall have the right of exercising national regional autonomy. The central government will not alter the existing political system, also will not alter the established functions, status, and power of the Dalai Lama. Officials of various ranks shall hold office as usual. The religious beliefs, customs, and habits of the Tibetan people shall be respected and Lama monasteries protected. The Tibetan, the spoken and written language, and the school education of the Tibetan nationality shall be developed step by step in accordance with the realities and conditions in Tibet. In matters relating to various reforms in Tibet, there shall be no compulsion on the part of the central authorities. The local government of Tibet should carry out of its own accord. And when the people raise demands for reform, they shall be settled by mutual consultation with leading persons of Tibet. With this point, I want to also highlight that, these are the promise made to the Tibetans during the negotiations. During the negotiation, when the Tibetan, for one example how the negotiations went on is when the Tibetan delegation rejected to point number 15 that stipulates the establishment of military and administrative committee in Tibet by the Chinese central government. The Chinese side responded angrily to the Tibetan delegation. Are you saying that you are against China? If this is the case, then you can go home. You need not to stay. We will send the People's Liberation Army. So that was one case of the outburst of the Chinese negotiators during the negotiations. And we can see these examples, how the real discussions on the 17-point agreement went during the talks. Now coming back to international law and validity of the agreement. Immediately on arriving in safety in India, His Holiness the Dalai Lama repudiated the agreement on the grounds that it had been signed under duress and military threat, and the Chinese authorities had broken the promises made to the Tibetans. When China invaded Tibet in 1950, Tibet was an independent nation. International law prohibits the acquisition of territories by military force. There is no dispute that the PRC used its military force to enter into Tibet. Therefore, the occupation and annexation of Tibet by the PRC represents a clear breach of international law. Moreover, the Tibetan people have never acquiesced to the Chinese occupation and never stopped resisting this illegal rule. As a result, the PRC continues to be deprived of any legal entitlement to its rule over Tibet. As a consequence, under international law, Tibet continues to be an independent nation under illegal occupation by the People's Republic of China. So that I would present as a statement. Maybe we can later discuss on the specific points that I've raised in these connections.
Thank you very much for this, Kezang. We'll just continue with Tinlai, who's going to also kind of wrap up a little bit about the situation in Tibet nowadays and what's been happening since the 17-point agreement was signed.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I would like to thank the Tibet Initiative Deutschland for inviting me to this very important discussion. Of course, it is an honor to share the panel with Honorable Kgesang Genzela, who is the former envoy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and continues to be a huge guiding persona for the Tibetan movement per se, and also activist, young activist from Hong Kong. My heart goes out to you because you share a situation which was experienced by my parents when they came from Tibet, crossing the Himalayas. Of course, you don't have to cross the mountains, but the mountains physically, but the mountains and the barriers that you have crossed to come to Germany must be way, way more difficult. So again, thank you so much for having me. And with regards to my statement, of course, Kong Kgesang Genzela has already given a very, very detailed description of the 17-point agreement, and also it's questioned its validity under the international law. Just to add on to what he has said, when we talk about any agreement, in the basic principles of agreement is nothing but a contract. So a basic principles of contract is that, firstly, that there should be free will, or that the consent that was given should be genuine consent. So as pointed out by Kong Kgesang Genzela, this agreement was signed under duress, under coercion, and with the military pressure. And that definitely violates one of the basic principles of contract, a valid contract. Secondly, of course, there should be, the contract should be signed by somebody who is competent to sign the contract. So there is a question about the competency or the capacity of the people who were signing the contract. If you look at the narration and the historical facts about what happened during the 17-point agreement, it's very evident that the people who were sent there as representatives of the Gande Podang and His Holiness the Dalai Lama, they were not sent there to sign any agreement. They were sent there to ask China to stop the military invasion. So they did not even have the stamp. In fact, the stamps that you see currently on that historical document was actually forged and manufactured in China. It's not the sign or the stamp of the Gande Podang. So they did not have the capacity, as we say in the legal terms, to sign that contract. And thirdly, there should be an intention to be bound by the legal document or the agreement. With the acts of China following the agreement, it is very evident that China did not have the intention that is required for an agreement to be legally valid, to be considered as a valid document. So for example, what I'm saying is that if you look at what happened right after the contract was signed or this agreement was signed, China immediately invaded Tibet, right? And they continued to destroy and breach all the principles that it agreed to, which basically means that they did not have the intention, the legal intent that is required to make that agreement valid. Also, moving back a little bit, I think it's very important to also know that China claims that Tibet was never an independent country and it always had ancient ties with China. If that is so, then why ask Tibetans to sign an agreement? Because an agreement is signed with independent parties, right? By the Chinese acknowledgement of this 17-article agreement or the 17-point agreement, it clearly shows that Tibet was historically an independent country and that it was invaded in the guise of the 17-point agreement. That is the first part of what I would want to say, add on to what already Ko Plesang and Zilla has noted. Moving on to what has happened since. I think it's very, very disturbing to see that when we talk about the destruction that happened in Tibet, a lot of people say that, oh, monasteries were destroyed, but that happened in China as well. Cultural institutions were destroyed, that happened in China as well. Because all of that happened in Cultural Revolution, right? Now, what is very important to make a distinction is that the Cultural Revolution in China started in the 60s, but the destruction of monasteries and the cultural institutions of Tibet started in 1952. 1951-52, right after the signing of the 17-point agreement. So to say that, what happened in Tibet is somehow not very relevant or not very distinct because it happened to the mainland China under Cultural Revolution, I think that's very wrong. Because the very fact that it started way earlier in Tibet, the very fact that it was so concentrated on ensuring that the identity of Tibetans and the religious beliefs of Tibetans are destroyed, I think that in itself shows that China has been systematically discriminating against Tibetans because they belong to a different nation, they belong to a very different race. So there is definitely a component of racial discrimination involved if you look at the UN conventions on this discrimination. Since that time, in his 70-character petition, the 10th Panchen Lama gives a very, very concerning narrative about what was the extent of this destruction. He speaks about more than 6,000 monasteries being destroyed. He speaks about Tibetans' dead bodies that were dumped in the grounds, and nobody was there to even give them a funeral rites. And this has gone on. It has not stopped in the 60s. It has continued in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and it continues to even this day. Many people say, and especially for China, it says that, oh, the troublemakers are just, the followers of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. However, if you look at who are the people who are raising voice in Tibet, it is the younger generation. It is the generation that has, that was born under the Chinese rule, that has been raised under the Chinese rule, that has been so systematically inserted with indoctrination. And that is the generation that is, raising against China, which clearly shows that it has nothing to do with whether His Holiness's teachings are being affected or not. It is clearly showing that there is a systematic and systemic discrimination against Tibetans, and Tibetans feel it, and they feel that they are being targeted and oppressed. If you look at the self-emulations, the self-emulations in Tibet started since 2009, and it continued for a very long time. And we have currently a recorded case of 155 self-emulations in Tibet. And we don't know how many more were there before that or during that time, because the information outflow is very, very difficult. Also, if you look at the sacred UN Human Rights Declaration, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, it points out 30 articles. And I must say that if you want me to sum up about the human rights situation in Tibet, every single right that is enshrined in that sacred document is being violated, and Tibetans are crying, are pleading for the international community to take a look at them and to be the voice for them, because they are not able to raise their voices.
Thank you very much, Tindai. We'll go on with Ray.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, and thank you to Tibet Initiative Deutschland to invite me to this very meaningful seminar to talk about, I would say, the essence of CCP. Because when we look at the what the CCP has done in Tibet, to Uyghur, to Chinese people, to Hong Kong people, we can realize the same pattern. I remember back in 2019 when I disclosed my refugee status in Bundesstadt, I gave a soundbite. I said, 60 years ago, Dalai Lama needed to flee its territory, flee its country due to the Chinese Communist Party. And 30 years ago, Chinese students who participated in the Tiananmen movement also needed to flee the country. And then in 2019, even Hong Kong, who live in such a free, democratic city for so long, finally also needed to flee the city. And yeah, I think the two speakers have already given some important remark as to how the CCP doesn't keep its work, and it's exactly the case in Hong Kong. So before talking about the Sino-British Joint Declarations, I may need to explain a bit of the historical background of Hong Kong. Before 1942, Hong Kong was just a very small fishing village, but due to the loss of the Opium War, Qing dynasty signed multiple conventions to divide part of its territories to the United Kingdom at that time. So since 1842, Hong Kong became a British colony, and because of this colonial history, Hong Kong had a very different developing path in comparison to that of in China. And why the UK and China needed to sign the British Joint Declarations to solve this problem is because one of the leases signed by Qing dynasty would expire in the 1st of July in 1997. So back in 1970s, 60s, at that time, the UK and the China and the Chinese didn't really know how to solve its problems after the expirations of the lease. And at that time, some people suggested that, the UK should keep Hong Kong at its colony, but the Chinese Communist Party strongly opposed this idea. And at that time, the party leader Zhou Enlai even threatened the UK by saying that we could unite Hong Kong by force. And at that time, the UK believed that it's unrealistic to deploy military actions to defend Hong Kong. So the UK was forced into a negotiations. So during the negotiations, UK raised its concerns to China, as in the freedom, the political system, and the rights of Hong Kong people. And China at that time agreed that after the handover, Hong Kong would remain the same. And that's what was stated in the British Sino-Joint Declarations. In this joint declarations, China promised not only the way of living, but also the fundamental rights, such as the right to protest, freedom of speech, freedom of press, at least remain at least 50 years. And the mini constitution of Hong Kong was also constituted based on the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And in our basic law, it's promised that Hong Kong will eventually become a democracy. And this is actually one of the reasons why Hong Kong people were so outraged in 2014 when the National People Congress made the decisions to control who could run the candidates, the chief executive elections. I think in this regards, many Westerners may ask why the UK would make such a deal back then, because at that time the Chinese Communist Party was communist, and it was popular motto in the West saying that don't make deal with any communists. But why the UK made this deal? So I had already said one of the factors is that they think it's unrealistic to defend Hong Kong with military. And the second factor is that at that time, China appeared to becoming a more open country under Deng Xiaoping, and a lot of Western China observers believed that China, once they become more prosperous, they would become an open country with respect of human rights, and some may even dream of a democratic China. So they make this gambling. They hope to make use of the capitalistic and the free Hong Kong to export such values to China. And the last factor I would say is because back in that time, a lot of Hong Kong elites were actually having a very strong Chinese nationalistic tendency. And also at that time in academia or in activist circle, the colonialism is a thing. So they thought, well, getting back to China is way better to be under the rule of the British Empire. And yeah, I think then the rest is history. And I expect in our upcoming discussions, we will talk more about what is happening in Hong Kong and why China held its promise in the first decade, but then why it's changed.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to everybody for all these opening statements. Perhaps I'd just like to start asking Ray a question directly about the Sino-British Joint Declaration. What's obvious in all the statements that we've heard now is that with both the 17-point agreement and with the Sino-British Joint Declaration, the Communist Party has always threatened force. They threatened to invade. And I guess it's a fair, it's probably fair enough to think that they would have done that as well if you wouldn't have agreed to sign the treaty. But do you think that the UK in the end was perhaps naive to agree to the Sino-British Joint Declaration? Or do you really think there was a threat in the 80s when, the international community would have obviously really looked at that as well? Like, do you think they would have really invaded Hong Kong? And do you think that looking back at this, the UK shouldn't have agreed to signing the treaty?
That's a very good question. I think not many Westerners are aware that there was a huge riot in 1967 taking place in Hong Kong during the Cultural Revolutions in China. At the time, there were a lot of Red Army already gathered next to the Hong Kong Chinese border, and they didn't invade Hong Kong yet. And at that time, the UK was trying to reach out to Beijing and ask them not to do it, and somehow they made a deal. Zhou Enlai ordered all the Red Army to retreat, and then all the Red Army just left the border. So we could see that the Chinese Communist Party at that time did really have the intentions to invade Hong Kong. But of course, if they had invaded, the whole development and the relationship between China and the West would have been a completely different story. But in hindsight, given that at that time the West thought China was ready to invade, and also the West didn't really want to defend Hong Kong through military way, and given that China appeared to be becoming more democratic and open, I won't say the UK was naive at that time. Now, I think if any Western country still believes CCP would hold its word, is very naive. After Tibet, after the Tiananmen massacre, after Hong Kong, and now Taiwan, if they still believe, then that would be naive. But back in that time, I understand there are a lot of limitations for them to do for Hong Kong people and to make a better policy. Margaret Thatcher, after signing the British Joint Declarations, gave a speech in the Legislative Council in Hong Kong. At that time, she said that she thought she has done a great deal, because you could imagine what would happen after the 1st of July in 1997 without a deal. That would be a complete chaos. So I agree to a certain extent. Yeah.
If we apply this to Tibet, perhaps Tin Lai, could you tell me, do you think that there was a real threat that the PLA would have definitely invaded Tibet if the Dalai Lama had left then and there without signing the 17-point agreement? And can you also perhaps explain a little bit the difficulty at the time that Tibet didn't really get support from the UK, from other countries that they had relations with at the time?
Yes, I think we can say as a matter of fact that the PLA would have definitely invaded Tibet with the military threat that they were hanging, because it's very important to know that after that article, even after signing that 17-point agreement, or what China nowadays calls 17-article agreement, I think it's important to see what happened after that. Despite signing, despite agreeing to their terms, they eventually went ahead with their plan, right? What the 17-point agreement did help was that it gave us that time to understand and see if there is any peaceful resolution, and maybe hoping that, we will have genuine autonomy. I think that was the time period that was available for us to see and experiment, because then you wouldn't want to come out and then regret maybe things would have been different, right? But if you look at what happened after the agreement, yes, there's no doubt, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that China would have gone ahead with that threat. Coming to your second question, I think it's very important. Of course, it's disappointing to know that the countries did not help. We had relationship with the UK, we had relationship with India, and many neighboring countries. But in the hindsight, if you just look at the entire world scenario, then the world had just emerged from the Second World War. Things were very chaotic. Many countries which are now superpowers were in real bad shape. The world had just gone into one battle, come out of one battle, and was maybe not ready to go into another battle. India had just gained its independence. Great Britain was losing a lot of its colonies. So maybe they were not ready to pick up another fight. Of course, I'm not justifying their action. For us, any support would have been a huge impetus for us to continue that struggle and maybe hope that the other countries would come to aid. But yeah, I think we have to also look at the larger picture about how the world was at that time.
Thank you very much. Seeing that now, 70 years later, Tibet is regarded as one of the least free regions in the world next to Syria, which is obviously a very big thing. Why do you think the international community isn't more alarmed? We have one question from the audience as well, asking why is the UN not helping Tibet? Perhaps Kelsang, you can answer that one. You have to unmute yourself. Sorry, we still can't hear you. Maybe.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, sorry. Yeah. No, I think in a way it's very simple, we see, in just, very at Palestine-Israel conflict at the, just now going on, the UN was actually inactive in a way. So it's a very complicated, until there is a consensus within the United Nations Security Council, it's difficult to act. And in the United Nations Security Council, there is never a consensus because, whatever the Western countries propose is rejected by Russia and China, and whatever Russia and China proposes is rejected by Western countries. So I think here, first of all, I want to say, invasion of Tibet. China invaded Tibet, they marched with an army of 40,000 troops into Tibet and defeated the Tibetan army in eastern Tibet. When the Tibetan army was defeated, the way to Lhasa was open. There was no defense by the Tibetan side, no army to hold the march of the People's Liberation Army. So therefore, military aggression took place in Tibet, and therefore, Tibetan delegation has to sign under this military threat. Tibetan delegation were left. The People's Liberation Army would go to Lhasa on an agreement or without an agreement. So that was a choice that the Tibetan people had. And since no country was able to help or willing to help Tibet, so Tibet has no other alternative but to accept that in the hope that the Chinese side would abide by the promises and commitment they have made in this agreement. So that's one point. Second thing, I think, what is very similar between Tibet and Hong Kong case is actually, the British government was trapped by the Chinese side with the concept of one country, two system. And if you look at the 17-point agreement, that's exactly one country, two system. Tibet would keep its political system, its government, and all this. Only that Tibet would, come back in the lap of the motherland. So that is, but as has been mentioned, for the Chinese Communist Party, seems to be treated as a means of first, overcoming an obstacle, not to find a peaceful coexistence or a consensus by both parties, but overcoming resistance, overcoming the first obstacle. So therefore, I think I was told by friends from Hong Kong that during the demonstrations in Hong Kong, you could see some slogans by the demonstrators, which stated, yesterday Tibet, today Hong Kong, tomorrow Taiwan. So that, I think, actually captures the way in thinking of the Chinese Communist Party, because the overriding interest of the Chinese Communist Party is their hold on the monopoly of power, their power, to keep their power. So for that goal, even, if it is in the interest, against the interest of the Chinese people and Chinese country, the Chinese Communist Party is willing to do it. For example, for one example, even now, today, the People's Liberation Army is not under the control of the Chinese government, but under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. It's the army of the Chinese Communist Party, not of the Chinese state. So therefore, this government, we see in the case of Hong Kong, we see in the case of the East Turkestan, so-called Xinjiang area, the threat of this CCP government is not only so-called minorities, but it is as a dictatorship. And this dictatorship is different from other dictatorships, that it is an institutionalized dictatorship. It's not dependent on one person. It's the party of 90 million party members. So this dictatorship is institutionalized. So therefore, it's much more difficult to pressure this dictatorship than in other cases, where the system of the repression relies solely on one person. So I think, so therefore, the regime of the Chinese Communist Party is not only a threat to the freedom of the people in Hong Kong or Tibet or Uyghurs, but slowly it's becoming very, very clear. It's also a threat for other countries, If you look, how many, even Western governments are afraid to speak out on human rights violations. Because if they do this, then they have difficulties in their trade relationship or in their financial relationship. And many of the industry and business people rely on their trade with China. There are pressure also from this side. So we see very clearly that this dictatorial regime poses not only a clear threat to so-called minorities in China, but also a threat to freedom everywhere in the world.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And I think people in all countries are becoming more and more aware of that as well. I was just wondering, Kezang, because the Human Rights Committee of the German Parliament this week has issued a statement about the 17-point agreement, in which they also say they support the middle way approach. They support the renewing of the Sino-Tibetan dialogue as well, for example, and they would like to have the legitimate representatives of Tibet talk to the Chinese government. So you were obviously part of the Sino-Tibetan dialogue until 2010. When you were talking directly to the Chinese government, did you talk about the 17-point agreement, and did they actually admit to the fact that they had breached the contract?
No, we did. Of course, we did not raise the 17-point agreement, because that's from the Chinese side. This is a closed chapter. This period of signing of the 17-point agreement, and I think the Tibetan side also. We wanted to open a new chapter in the relationship between China and Tibet. In the past, there has been a lot of, misunderstanding, a lot of destruction and suffering, a lot of resentment, maybe on both sides. So, in order to overcome this very sad chapter in the relationship between Tibet and China, we were willing to open a new chapter. So we stretched our hand to the Chinese side, saying, we are willing to be part of the peoples of China if you genuinely accord to the Tibetan people a genuine autonomy, so that we are in a position to preserve in our own homeland our religion, our culture, our language, and our traditions. So that with this spirit, we went to China and tried to find a mutual understanding. Unfortunately, the Chinese side were not willing to, to shake hands with us and to really discuss with us the realities in Tibet, and to try to find together some mutual understanding and some mutual acceptable solution.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Ray, do you think that the final or the biggest breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration was the National Security Law last year, or do you think this has happened much more before that? And if you look back at the protests taking place since 2014 and over the last few years, how do you think these protests have developed? Do you think they have changed, or how have you felt these protests yourself?
Yeah, for me, when did I realize that China is not going to uphold the Sino-British Joint Declaration is way before the anti-extradition law movement. It was 2012 when the Hong Kong government proposed national education curriculum, which is mandatory for all the pupils to learn about China. And in those materials, the image of China is completely different from the reality. For example, they would say, oh, the one-party system in China is actually the best ever political system. When you look at the political disputes happening every day in the US, it was because of democracy. And at that time, I already realized that, oh, actually, China is covertly changing our way of living. And yeah, some may ask why CCP upheld the basic law, one country, two systems for the first decade. I would argue against it, because what CCP was doing during that period was to united fronts, different sectors, different influential people from different classes in Hong Kong in order to gain its political power. And once they have everything prepared and they see that the moment is already mature enough for them to take a step further, then they would definitely take a step further. So in 2012, I realized, and at that time, the majority of Hong Kong people still didn't realize the real ambitions of the CCP. They thought it's just maybe because of the insecurity of China, because of its unique, shameful history. And a lot, when you look at a survey as to how Hong Kong people identified themselves back in 2012. Actually, quite a lot of Hong Kong people still identified themselves as Chinese, but younger generations have already changed its perspective. We started to ask some fundamental questions. For example, why Hong Kong should be part of China? Why we are Chinese? And at that time, there were a lot of disputes between different groups. And then in 2014, the People National Congress basically just banned the development of the democratic political system of reform in Hong Kong. At that very moment, Hong Kongers finally realized that, well, under the rule of CCP, such an authoritarian regime, we could never get our rights of self-determination, democracy, such political rights. At that time, a lot of young people after the Umbrella Revolution wanted to know or wanted to find out another way out, and they asked, what is the biggest obstacle of the democracy movement? And we realized that, well, it's because we at that time thought that we are Chinese, and we are confined in this mindset because, well, we are Chinese, we are from the same family, we have yellow skin, black hair, black eyes. So whatever the CCP does to me, we have to tolerate them and we have to give them time. But Meanwhile, CCP is covertly undermining our values, and we are afraid that, yeah, we might give them time, give them 2 decades, 3 decades, maybe till 2047, 50 years. But at that time, who will be changed? It's not China, it's Hong Kong. And so after the Umbrella Revolution, more young people take another approach in contrast to that of traditional pandemics. They emphasize our unique identity, our unique history and language. We hope by preserving our identity, our values such as freedom and democracy could also be preserved. I think in this regard, Tibetans, Taiwanese, and Uyghurs would share our idea, and yeah. So the whole democratic movement evolves in the way that more Hong Kong people realize under the rule of CCP, we could not gain democracy. We have to look for a new way out. We may ask for self-determination, or some young people who are radical like me, advocate Hong Kong independence. And in 2019, why such a law, this extradition law could incite such a rage in Hong Kong society is because this law undermined the very fundamental values of the society, namely the independent judiciary. And plus what we have experienced since 2014, Hong Kong people could no longer tolerate, could no longer remained inactive. So what we have suppressed just got explode in this movement.
Thank you very much. I think that gave us a really nice overview of what actually happened throughout the last, well, pretty much 10 years already in Hong Kong. And do you sometimes worry that Hong Kong might become the next Tibet, like Kedang mentioned earlier? You know, like people are already saying this. Or do you also see an opportunity in the fact that there are Tibetans, there are Uyghurs, there are Taiwanese and Hong Kongers, there's so many groups, Christians, Falun Gong, you know, like the list is endless actually in China. Do you think there's a chance as well that people can really unite and kind of get more attention also from, you know, the international community and so on?
Well, I think when we look at the trend right now, is exactly happening. I mean, people who are oppressed by the same authoritarian regime are getting together now. Today, I attended a seminar organized by a Tibet concerned organizations, and I have been in touch with Uyghur, Taiwanese people, and also Chinese dissidents. And I think that the movement in Hong Kong taking place in 2019 actually was a wake-up call for the West to realize, well, yes, China got more prosperous, but they are not turning to be a democratic country and open society as they expected. And now this is the time for the West to adjust or maybe to reshape their China policy. And I believe, as the West was already experienced in countering such authoritarian regimes like Soviet Union, I am hopeful that as long as people all the freedom lovers stand together and don't give up on our fight. Someday, what has happened to the Soviet Union could also happen to the CCP. And at that time, I believe everyone could go back to our Heimat.
Thank you. I would like to ask Tinlai now about, so we've spoken about genuine autonomy for Tibet, so both in the 17-point agreement, but also then later in the middle way approach. The concept is that Tibet has genuine autonomy with political and cultural rights and self-determination. Do you think that, I'm not talking about independent Tibet right now, but I'm talking about autonomous Tibet. Do you think that this would also help to contribute some of the maybe geopolitical tensions in the area? For example, when we look at the China-India border conflict, do you think that Tibet, if it would be stronger and more politically autonomous, that would help with these kind of tensions as well?
Yes, definitely. I think if you look at the Strasbourg proposal of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and also the eventual middle way approach policy that was developed from that proposal, the entire idea about having a genuine autonomy in Tibet is to ensure that that Tibet is recognized as a zone of peace, so that you have two giants of Asia. Definitely there are bound to be some tension there, but with Tibet now being occupied, these two giants are, at loggerheads, because China was very particular that when it occupied Tibet, its entire intention was to eventually occupy the entire Himalayan belt. And thankfully, with the growing power of India, they have been able to stop to an extent. But this kind of territorial invasion on the Indian territory is happening and will continue to happen. So with the creation of Tibet as a genuine autonomous region and eventually becoming a zone of peace, definitely this territorial tension that is there in between these two giants will be curtailed to a very large extent. Also, if I may be allowed to pick up on your previous question on the UN, I think a lot of people question that, is there any hope with the UN? Because Tibetans have been protesting in front of the UN for a very long time. We have been sending petitions upon petitions to the UN and asking whether, and now we are at wit's end to understand what is it that we are missing and that whether there is hope in continuing it. For that, my answer would be, definitely there is hope, but it is very important to understand the system that we are trying to gain support from needs to be clearly understood, as Kongo Kesang Enzela already said about the Security Council. The entire purpose of why China is investing so much in African countries, why it is investing so much in the Eastern European countries. There are 193 members in the UN. It is divided into 5 regions, and the regions are Africa, Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Western Europe. If you look at which is the largest chunk of countries, which region has the largest chunk of countries, it is Africa, and then it is Asia. So when you are pumping so much investment into these countries, China is basically trying to build a vote bank for UN, because everything in UN is decided based on votes, right? So for my answer to the question, whether we have we not done enough at the UN, I think no, 100 times no. We have to see systematically how to hold those pressure points. We have definitely not done enough. There is so much more to be explored. And also, it is very important that the UN is an international organization. There is no other organization which is standing in parallel to the UN. And therefore, unless there is another international organization which can come and stand in place of the UN, that is the available avenue. And to just give a very personal anecdote, I think it's very important to understand that we are the imagined realities of our parents. When they fled from Tibet, they could not, they did not have the modern education. They did not even have the means to survive themselves. But they strived very hard. They worked very hard to ensure that the next generation of Tibetans are educated. Now it is upon us because we are living their dreams. And with that, I think it's also our responsibility to continue that struggle. So I think I do not want to sound like I'm lecturing, but definitely I think we have many more avenues to explore. So my request to everybody out there would be, let's not give up hope. We have many times to do that, but this is not the time.
There's been one question from the audience who sounds a little bit more concerned about whether one country, two systems will really work because of the CCP, and that it's proved in the past that it doesn't really consider its obligations under the several contracts. And so Secho asks, has the time not come for the CTA to reconsider the middleweight policy? I think you've kind of answered that question in your statement just now, but I'm just wondering, do you think that this is still a policy that might work under this particular government, under Xi Jinping as well?
I think there are two things to consider when we are talking about middleway policy. And of course, I'm not the right person to talk about the change in the policy. I am a civil servant inside the Tibetan government in exile, popularly known as Central Tibetan Administration. So I'm definitely not the right person to be speaking or commenting on it, but I would want to give some food for thoughts. It's very important for any organization, especially when it is a government entity, to stand by a certain kind of policy. It cannot be like, today I want to be a middleway policy, tomorrow independence, and because independence did not work, then let's go back to middleway policy. No. If you have taken a policy, then you try to go to the end, right? It's not, you cannot flip-flop all the time. Secondly, if we give up middleway policy and tomorrow, if we say that, yeah, we want independence, what is it going to achieve next? I think there are certain things, like that you have to understand before a government can make any changes. I think any change in the policy should definitely come about after a thorough examination of the current status and the future prospects. And one of the reasons why we have received garnered such strong international support is also because we have stood by our ground that we are seeking for genuine autonomy and not independence, because please remember, under the UN laws, the basic principle is territorial integrity. So the minute you start talking about independence, you are violating one of the basic principles of the UN, and the UN members, which is 193 countries, may not support you. So you have to be very careful when you make a change in the policy. So I think I would want to stop at that.
Maybe Kaizang, would you like to add on to this?
I agree with Chichila that any fundamental change in the course of political aims or goals should be really considered well. But I think I don't think that for the foreseeable future there will be any change in the position of the Central Tibetan administration, because as long as His Holiness the Dalai Lama is among us, I think the overwhelming majority of the Tibetan people will stick to the course that he has proposed. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama has proposed the middle way approach to solve the Tibetan problem, not only to overcome the present difficulties and challenges faced by the Tibetan people, but also His Holiness, I think there is also his hope to make a contribution to a political culture that is also embraced by the international community. And this political culture is, first of all, trying to find solution to conflicts and clashes of interest strictly through nonviolence. That's one of his aims. Secondly, His Holiness always says that he is a very strong and great admirer of the European Union. And for that, because he admires the spirit of the European Union. And this spirit, the European Union is actually, from the beginning, it is a peace project. Nations and countries that have fought against each other for many centuries, now joining together for a common cause. So His Holiness feels that in our modern time, where the interdependence in the world is so strong, that this spirit of this European spirit is needed also elsewhere. For example, in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa also, where nations and people join together to for a larger interest and goal. So that in that respect, His Holiness feels if Tibetans would not seek separation and independence, but express willingness to remain in this big nation called Peoples of China, and if Tibetan can make a contribution to a peaceful coexistence of different ethnic groups, religions, and so on, it would be a very enticing and very powerful example to other parts of the world, you know. So therefore, it's not, you know, many people think because China is too powerful and Tibetan have no way of achieving independence, so therefore they want to, they are willing to accept autonomy within the framework of People's of China. That's, of course, His Holiness is considering the political realities too. But I think his driving motivation and aim is he believes that the world is becoming smaller. National borders are of no importance. So people, the attempt for people to live together in a larger community is the call of the time and our. So therefore, this is I think one of the motivation. So I think, you know, for that reason, as long as His Holiness the Dalai Lama leaves, there will be no change on this position of the Central Tibetan administration. But as an individual Tibetan, I really think, you know, under the present leadership in China, under President Xi Jinping, I don't see any possibility of engaging in a meaningful and constructive dialogue. There's no way, it would be really naive to believe that we can have meaningful dialogue as long as this present Chinese leadership is there, you know. So therefore, I believe for Hong Kong, for Uyghurs, and for Taiwan, and for all, for democratic government, our aim and intention must be to bring changes in China, more reform-minded government, more opening, more rule of law, less censorship, more free flow of information. So therefore, if we are able to bring about changes in China, then if there is a different group of people in China in leadership, in the government and in the leadership, maybe there might be a new there might be again a possibility to engage in meaningful and honest dialogue. So I think, and I want to say to my young friend from Hong Kong, I really, you know, of course I have followed the democratic movement in Hong Kong since I think 2012 or so on. And I admire, what is so encouraging to me is that it seems that the majority of the people in these movements are young people. That means, you know, it's this movement will go on for a long time to come. So therefore, I think what is important in our struggle is, first of all, perseverance. I think it is important that we realize that changes will not come quickly or fast. It may take some time. We must have the determination to keep our struggle, to keep going our struggle. So determination is very important. Secondly, I think I mentioned already that your movement remains non-violent. It's also very, very important. And young people can be, you know, easily become very bitter and frustrated. And if frustration and bitterness takes over, then it can lead easily to violence. And that, I think, will make this struggle of Hong Kong people for more democracy even more difficult and even more tragic. So I think I just wanted to express this to you here.
Thank you. I think maybe, Ray, do you want to answer directly to that? I think that's some very interesting points.
Yeah, thank you. And I found Mr. Gyatson's the suggestion and advices for the movement in Hong Kong is very inspiring. It reminds me of my first meet with His Holiness in 2016. It was really, yeah, it was unforgettable experience in my life, because I was in a university attending a seminar, and His Holiness was the speaker. And when I remember when I entered the room, I immediately feel the warmth radiating from His Holiness. And after the talk, we were surrounding His Holiness, and His Holiness even touched my face. And then I remember one Tibetan came to me and said, "Oh, you are really blessed. You are really blessed." And actually at that time, His Holiness told me exactly the same thing. Hong Kong young people should keep on our fighting, but in a non-violent way. And on one hand, because I am also very interested in Tibetan Buddhism, so I fully understand the importance of non-violence means and this faith. But on the other hand, I also have sympathy to people who are on the ground. I was one of them. I understand that the frustration is unbearable. Yeah, human being are rational being, but at the same time we are also emotional being, and not everyone could have the ability to control or to make the best decisions every moment. And that's why I think for example, the Tibetan diaspora, what they are doing is in the West, in overseas, is to spread these methods for people to be more enlightened, to be more aware of our own emotions and our own presuppositions, how we come to this state. And this is actually another way to change the society, to change the world. And I think now the Hong Kong's democratic movement has already entered to another phase, namely we could no longer fight in Hong Kong, but we have to carry on in other countries. And I think the experience and the inspirations from the Tibetan diaspora would really be one of our examples, in German, Vorbild for the development of our diasporic community. And yeah, really thank you very much for your inspirations. And yeah.
Thank you to both of you. I think this was actually a really nice way to end this discussion. I'd like to ask one more question, because we've got one more question from the audience to Kezang, and then I guess after that, I think the talk will be over. And I thank all of you very, very much for being here and answering these questions. I think this kind of exchange as well between Tibet and Hong Kong and all the other groups as well is so important at the moment. And I think I can also see that this is going on more and more. And as Tinlai said as well, there's so much more to be done, and I think we're all aware of that. So thank you very much for talking with us today. And so the last question just before the end would be to Kezang. Tenzin wants to know, what can we do to resume the Sino-Tibetan dialogue? Is there any way we can have this dialogue again after so many years?
Yes, I think, for any people, like for the people in Hong Kong, for the Uyghur in East Turkestan, we all have to be active. We all have to work day by day. We need to raise the difficult situation of our people inside Tibet. We need to highlight the human rights violations perpetrated by the Chinese authorities in Tibet, and I think also that the Chinese Communist Party, this totalitarian regime, is a threat not only to Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Hong Kongers, but to the liberal international system and to democracy everywhere, making clear I would say the DNA of the Chinese Communist Party, that it is in nature a totalitarian regime, making it clear, and therefore it needs to be the international community must come together in bringing necessary changes in China, and not by dealing with this totalitarian regime and thereby strengthening the position and the power of this totalitarian regime. For example, if I think democratic countries need to also need to be aware the more they trade and interact with this regime in different fields, there is the possibility that they are, by this trading and by this interaction, they are strengthening the position of this regime in China, among the Chinese people and in the world. So therefore, I'm not proposing boycott of this regime, but people need to find ways and means to change this regime and to bring more, as I mentioned earlier, more freedom of information, more opening, and more possibility for the Chinese people to learn the realities about the world and to learn the realities of the situation. Because at the moment, because of the censorship, there is, so much indoctrination and manipulation of information by the Chinese Communist Party. So, because of lack of information, many people in China feel very, very nationalistic and feel moral obligation to support this totalitarian regime. And they feel that the rest of the world are against China or against Chinese people. Definitely not. We Tibetans, in the case of the Tibetans, we are not anti-China. We are not anti-Chinese. What we are is against the dictatorial system of this Chinese Communist Party. That is the issue, not to be against China or against Chinese people. So therefore, I think, we Tibetans have the very unique feature that many Chinese people in China who know a little bit about Tibet, about Buddhism, about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and about the actual situation in Tibet. Many of these Chinese democracy and human rights activists are supporting the Tibetan position, the Tibetan cause. So therefore, I think if there is less censorship in China, if the Chinese people would have the possibility to really have to know more about the outside world, they will be in a better position to judge what is right and what is wrong. So I think this is important,
Well, thank you very much for these last words. And I hope you all have a very nice evening. I'm looking forward to speaking to you again on these topics very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.